Hey, and hello, everybody. Bruce Bessette here, avionicseducation.com. In this video, I didn't have a chance to announce it, and I'm terribly sorry. I've been really busy. But what I want to cover today was a couple stories that I got over the last couple of weeks. And again, I do cover some FAA-related regulatory questions, and these are two good ones that have to deal with what to do. Sorry.
avionicseducation.com.
Yep.
In this video, I didn't have a chance.
This is terrible.
I'm terribly sorry. I've been really busy. But what I...
Wow, that's terrible. Totally professional, right? I've been watching the trial with Emily D. Baker, which I really like, but she was covering the trial. So I haven't been thinking about subjects, but this is a subject that came up, talking about what to do after declaring an emergency. And we'll get a little bit into not so much the emergency situation itself for pilots, but what to do as an aircraft owner. Now I've got an aircraft that had to land. What do I do now? Welcome, aviation enthusiasts and dreamers. If we haven't met before, my name is Bruce Bessette. I am an expert in all things airplanes. I'm a 40-year survivor in the aviation industry. I teach avionics, maintenance, aircraft ownership, and FAA regulations. I teach both online and in classrooms. My students come from high school, colleges, repair stations, and the FAA Academy. So let's start a conversation and shed some light on this wild world of aviation. Welcome back, everybody. In this video, we're going to be talking about a situation to where I have a mechanic who had just finished a 100-hour inspection on an aircraft. And then the mechanic gets that dreaded phone call. The aircraft had a problem in flight and had to declare an emergency. And any mechanic working out there doesn't want to hear that the airplane they just finished working on landed out somewhere. The situation here that the aircraft was, without getting into details, the aircraft was completed 100-hour inspections and it got a couple of new propellers installed on it. It had all the inspections were done, all the tests were done on the ground, everything worked perfectly. The aircraft got into an icing situation and turned on those brand new propellers. Well, the old system that were taken off were probably deactivated for many, many years. But the mechanic was still worried about what happened. So gets a call from the owner. Everything landed. The aircraft was about eight-hour drive away, but it landed safely. And they put it away in a hangar. And they said that during the flight, they entered icing conditions and they put on the anti-ice systems and then they lost both alternators. Now, alternator systems in a 100-hour inspection are tested, but they're not usually messed with. So there was nothing that was changed in the alternator system. So the only other thing that was changed, we had a situation that the propellers were changed and it put on new prop heats. But the thing that also kind of triggered the mechanic was the fact that they reported a vibration. Excuse me. In the aircraft during this situation. And you're flying at night, you get into icing, you're not a particularly experienced pilot, but you get into this stressful situation, you go to your training, and that's what happened in this place. They went to their training, they lost electrical power, they immediately called ATC, they needed to land immediately. They were given, I would assume, vectors to land to this airport and landed safely. And they got on the ground. They immediately called their mechanic. And that is a good idea, and I'll tell you why in a second. So the situation was, I had another situation. This was told to me. Again, these are all kind of third party. To where I get a call from an investigator who's dealing with another in-flight emergency. And it was a flight instructor and a student pilot. They were an hour and a half into a cross-country flight. And the engine all of a sudden started making horrific noise. They had immediate engine problems. They were on ATC. They had flight following. They called for an immediate landing. They declared an emergency. Remember, when you declare an emergency and you need to get down quickly, ATC is going to clear the airspace for you and make sure you have everything you need. So air traffic control keeps track of this. So they land safely. But in this case situation, they were met by the fire department, even though it was it was at an airport, but it was at an airport way out away from civilization. So fire department and the sheriff's department met them when they landed. In this situation, when they opened the cowl to go look and see what happened, they found a spark plug sitting on the case loose, and the lead off. Which again, there was pictures of this, and that's what I was told. And the people who flew it said, "Well, we don't want to wait overnight," because they called back to the owner of the aircraft, and they weren't going to get anybody there immediately. So they made arrangements to be picked up from a friend on another airplane, and they flew back home. Okay, so the airplane was left at the airport, secured, tied down at night. Okay, so in this situation, the owner grabbed the local mechanic, again, the same person who'd been working on the aircraft. So now we have two situations. We have two emergency landings, both ended with happy endings. In this case here, when they went through and they both landed safely. There was no damage to the aircraft from the landing of the emergency, and they both called maintenance, and that's the proper thing to do. Now, we talk about emergency in-flight problems, and there could be a multitude of reasons why a pilot feels the need to declare an emergency. Sometimes they're lost. Sometimes they get disoriented. Sometimes you have a medical emergency on the aircraft. Or, seems like more often lately, is we're seeing mechanical difficulties. And that's something I'm looking at on the news a lot. I'm hearing, in fact, just last week we had that aircraft. It was a 414 also, and an elderly gentleman. And I always want to say, if you're an elderly gentleman flying an aircraft, you're a skilled person. In fact, you probably have so much muscle memory that anything you do in the aircraft is pretty much reflex. So you never want to say, because the person's aged, well, that led to a factor in the accident. I'm just going based on the fact that we all saw the video of this 414 declaring a problem with the engine, and the pilot had tried to make a turn back to the airport. And we could all armchair quarterback the accident. When I was an FAA inspector, I did 100 or plus. I guess I stopped counting how many accidents I actually did, because it really started becoming kind of gross on my part, the number of accidents I was doing. And most of them were fender benders, run off the runways, striking something on the ground, getting, these were, the fatal ones were thankfully few and far between. But we keep talking about that situation. We had a maintenance issue, and we're starting to see more and more maintenance issues as, quite frankly, the number of available mechanics is going down. So we get back to the first situation. This was a complex multi-engine aircraft flown into icing conditions. The mechanic treated it as an AOG, aircraft on ground, and went up to go meet the aircraft. The owners, they rented an aircraft, they did their business, what they did. But they came back and met the mechanic the next morning. And, of course, the person who's doing the maintenance is going to grab the borescope and say, well, if they report a vibration in the engine and I just changed, or the mechanic just changed the propeller, this is what I would do. I would start looking at, okay, where do you get vibrations introduced to an engine? Loose bolt come loose, maybe the spinner's loose. And the mechanic went through and checked that first thing that night. And there was nothing visibly wrong with the aircraft. Everything was normal. All the bolts were in place. There was no oil. There was no damaged. He checked the engine mounts and looked at the engine cowls and things like that. Nothing visual there, but the keys had left with the aircraft, so he had to come back the next morning. So in the situation, the next morning, the mechanic meets with the owners of the aircraft and the pilot, and they discussed what happened. Well, they could get the generators to reset on the ground, because it was just a simple situation of remembering how to flash set a set of alternators. So if I lose both alternators on an aircraft, I've got a multi-engine aircraft. The whole point of having a multi-engine aircraft is, why would I lose both alternators on a basically was supposed to be a dual system? Now, there are some shared systems, and anti-ice is one of them on the aircraft. So re-engaged the alternators, put on all the systems, did a couple engine runs, repositioned the spinner just in case. No vibration, no shakes, the bolts, everything was normal. I'm beginning to think that and this is again secondhand, that the vibration was probably the fact that because the alternators had failed into the icing conditions, that meant ice was forming on the propellers, and it's possible that maybe you had an out of balance situation with ice forming on one or more of the propeller blades unevenly, and that would cause a vibration. When they did an engine run the next day, it worked fine. So that was a no defect notice situation. They went through all the systems. The determination is that, okay, we put brand new propellers on the aircraft. The aircraft anti-ice system has not operated in many, many years. However, the rest of the aircraft had been modified over the years with different avionics. And the determination, the most likely cause, was the fact that the new propellers, being new and haven't been running so long and running on the old alternators have been on the aircraft for 40 years, they were the original alternators, that the 50 amp units just can't handle the new load on these new propellers. The propellers were more efficient. More modern propellers produce more heat. So deactivated, deferred the anti-ice system, said don't fly it in known icing conditions, don't use the anti-ice systems, and fly it home. The mechanic does a logbook entry. That's the important part, is that the aircraft was inspected by maintenance after an in-flight emergency, and then the in-flight emergency was solved. Great. And then the pilot got back on the airplane. They did a quick test flight around the pattern. They gave the mechanic a call on the phone. They said everything works great, and the airplane flew back home. And the mechanic drove back home. But that's the right thing to do it. When you have an in-flight emergency, especially notifying ATC you have an in-flight mechanical emergency, then the aircraft becomes unairworthy. Okay, but now we move to the second situation. Okay, this was the pilot, the student, and a flight instructor, single-engine aircraft. A spark plug came out of the hole. And I imagine when that spark plug comes out of the hole, and it was a newly overhauled engine, that this was what I was told by the investigator. It was a newly overhauled engine. And with the spark plug out of the hole, that's all that exhaust gas hitting that cowl like a hammer. I imagine it's quite frightening. It would probably shake up a lot of people to where you have the normal noise of the engine's running, then you go to the hammering sound of your engine failing. So I'm sure it was distressful for the pilots, so they decided not to stay with the aircraft. But ATC knew about it. They diverted the aircraft, landed safely. Okay, but in this situation, the same thing. Now the aircraft has an open discrepancy. Okay, it's unairworthy. Okay, but wait, somebody says to me, well, it's not written in a logbook. And I said, yes, that's true. In air carrier world, they have it in their manuals. As part of being an air carrier, they have process procedures that any discrepancy must be written down in the aircraft logbooks. And these are logbooks that are carried specifically on the aircraft. So I used to work for 2 airlines, and we had logbooks in the aircraft, and if it went to a maintenance base, it was inspected by a mechanic, and the mechanic would sign off whatever overnight check was required, and the aircraft was cleared for return to service, either through performance of maintenance or clearing a discrepancy that the crew put in. In Part 91, there's no requirement for an aircraft logbook per se, or the only logbooks that are required are the records that are used to record maintenance as it happens. In the real world, we go up as mechanics, and really the only entry in the logbook is at the time that the mechanic is clearing the entry. So I'll go through and I keep blank logbook entries. I'll put in discrepancy, what was reported to me by the pilot, and then I'll put in corrective action, And under 43.9, corrective action, the work performed, the reference to data, and by virtue, I don't have to say I've approved the aircraft for return to service, because it says in 43.9, we'll get to the regulations in a second, by virtue of signing the record, in other words, my date, my number, my name, the signature, and the work performed, that constitutes a return to service after maintenance. Boom. But in this situation, the investigator calls up the owner and the mechanic and said how to go with the airplane. And that was reported. I'm not 100, like I said, I'm not 100% sure who said what, but they said, we didn't find anything wrong. We just hopped in it and flew it home. Okay, so now the question comes to me, is there a violation? Okay. And there's no logbook entry, but maintenance had been done. And then the other question that was asked me by the investigator is, who really is in violation here for operating the aircraft? Who's at fault? And I just want to real quickly go over, let's see if I can pull it up here on DRS. So I want to pull up the DRS is the computer system that we use now for come on, Bruce, to get our regulations. And I'm just going to read them to you because I cannot seem to find it. I'm terribly sorry, but look it up yourself. We're going to go to 91403, and the 400 series regulations are talking about in the general operating rules, and that's subpart E, starting with 400, and that's for maintenance, preventive maintenance, and alterations on aircraft. And under A, under general, which is 91403, it says really clearly, the owner operator of an aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft in an airworthy condition, including compliance with Part 39 of this chapter, which is airworthiness directives. So the owner operator is responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft, and we've talked about what is airworthiness. It meets its type design, properly altered condition, and is safe for flight. And then Part 39 is talking about airworthiness directives. In other words, has the FAA issued out an airworthiness directive, meaning that there's an unsafe condition, the owner or operator of the aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft. Oh wait, that person's not a mechanic. That's true, but the owner operator is responsible to find out and get the right person to perform the maintenance. And that's where these rules tie in to where if I have somebody signing something under Part 43 maintenance, it says that person's got to be certificated on Part 65, a mechanic. The next part, it says, this is interesting under subparagraph B, no person may perform maintenance, preventive maintenance, or alterations on an aircraft other than as prescribed in the subpart and other applicable regulations, including 43 of this chapter, right? Which means that nobody else other than a mechanic or an inspector, including people who do work under Part 43, which is our maintenance rules, can work on the aircraft. So that says that if you're an owner of an aircraft, you cannot be doing maintenance per se. You can do preventive maintenance, and that's another video, but you cannot be doing maintenance per se. And then it gets down into Part 121, 135. So that's under C. No person may operate an aircraft for which a manufacturer's maintenance manuals or instructions for continuing airworthiness has been issued that contains airworthiness limitation sections unless, and it talks about mandatory replacement times, inspection intervals, requirements to do an annual. Inspection interviews could also mean your progressive inspection and related procedures specified in that section or alternative inspection intervals, so on and so forth. So under 91403, the airplane been reported to the owner that the aircraft is down with an airworthiness issue. Okay. The first airplane was the fact that we had a jumbo alternator failure and we had vibrations in the propellers and stuff. And then mechanic investigated, tested the aircraft, returned the aircraft to service, allowed the pilots to fly away. In the second situation, it gets reported that, oh, we found nothing wrong. well, wait a sec. Somebody's got a picture, and now the investigator has a picture of the spark plug sitting on top. And it was told to me that you could see that there was markings on a brand new engine, newly overhauled engine, and it had marks that the spark plug had left, which meant it's an obvious discrepancy. The aircraft cannot operate with a spark plug out of its hole. No matter how hard you try, it won't operate safely. Reason being is that all that flame and fire is going to come out of that spark plug hole, and it's going to burn a hole in that cowl, and there's oil lines and everything else around that, and that could catch the engine on fire. So whenever we operate an engine, we want to keep fire inside. That's the whole point of it. So that's under Part 91, and then it gets into maintenance required 91.405. And in that section, this is where it gets very careful here. It says, now, each owner-operator of an aircraft, just like we talked about before, owner-operator of the aircraft is responsible for maintenance of the aircraft, shall have that aircraft inspected as prescribed in subpart E of this part, and shall, between required inspections, except as Part C, we'll talk about that in a second, have discrepancies repaired as prescribed in Part 43 of this chapter. And we're going to talk about 43.9 here in a minute. And it says under paragraph B, shall ensure that maintenance personnel make appropriate entries in the aircraft maintenance records, indicating that the aircraft has been approved for return to service. And then here we go. C talks about like what we did with the first aircraft, where we said the alternators can't handle the new propellers, so we deactivated the propellers. We put a 91, I forgot the number, essentially a 91-213 MEL, restricting the operation of the system. Leave the system off, don't fly into icing conditions, and you're safe for flight. The aircraft is safe to continue until we can get it back for maintenance. So the mechanic is going to, in fact, the owners have already ordered 100 amp alternators for this aircraft. They want to keep it safe. But in the other situation, you had an emergency, a known discrepancy, but when somebody's asking an investigator, an FAA person, oh, we did nothing to it and we flew it back. Now we're talking false statement. And that was it. That was the argument we had. What can we do? Well, we've already learned who's responsible for maintenance of the aircraft. Is it the mechanic? Well, the mechanic would go through and say, well, I found nothing wrong and they flew it back. Okay, well, somebody fixed the airplane. Well, who's responsible for that aircraft? 91.405 says each owner or operator of the aircraft. So the mechanic can say, just about anything. And everybody remembers Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien used to come around. He'd do a lot of lectures, and he was kind of everybody's mechanic. Because even though he was FAA, in fact, he was FAA headquarters, he could speak in a way that was realistic. Talking about warranties for mechanics, for example. And he would say, it'll be funny, that the warranty for maintenance work really basically only lasts till the end of the runway. And the reason being is that you cannot tell, that a maintenance action, always, there's some indications, that the last person who worked on the aircraft may have caused an indication to where we had a failure of the aircraft. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but mostly it's hard to prove unless the person says, well, yeah, I didn't torque it or something like that. And that's really, the NTSB does that if it does lead to an accident. I had an accident many years ago with a helicopter, aeromedical, and they did not safety wire the fuel controller for the engine. And after a few minutes, it vibrated off, and the engine on the helicopter went to low idle. So it basically went to idle, turbine engine. And the crew started to auto-rotate because you lost power. The problem is that when he went to auto-rotate, it unloaded the engine, and the RPMs came back up to 100%. He thought, oh, great, the engine came back, and it didn't. So then he pulled the collector back up to start flying again, and the rotor speeds dropped down because there was no fuel going to the engine, and everybody died in the helicopter because somebody forgot to torque something. It was a torque issue or a safety issue. If somebody forgot to say it, it's the smallest thing that brings down an aircraft. So getting back to this point, smallest thing. Okay, so the investigator asked me, okay, do we go after the pilot, the owner operator, or do we go after the mechanic? And I told him the issue is, okay, it was a known discrepancy. How do you prove it? Well, ATC tapes, sheriff's department, it declared an emergency, which means they have records of that. So it's not something you could hide. And they found an evidence of a discrepancy in the aircraft. He's found a spark plug laying on top of the engine. Okay, it's just fortunate that nothing bad happened. Okay, but the airplane was put away. The mechanic and the pilot didn't get there till the next day. And they could say, well, the mechanic said, well, it was nothing wrong. So he's kind of saying to the investigator, well, you proved that it wasn't there. Okay, but whose airplane is it? It belongs to the owner operator. And nobody should be working on that aircraft unless the owner operator says, go work on the aircraft. And it looks like to me in this situation, and this is what it would go if it went to the NTSB law judge, it would go to the investigator, and he would sit down, and he'd have the mechanic sitting there, and you have the pilot sitting there, and you were told that the aircraft had an emergency. Yes. And you brought your mechanic with you to fix it. Yes. And then did anybody else work on the aircraft? Did you make arrangements? No. So the most logical situation is that they fixed the airplane, simple fix, and flew it away, but then decided to make a false statement. And falsification is not a good thing when dealing with the FAA. When in reality, my suggestion is talk to the owner, because the owner sounded young, and get him to find out if he understood how to own an airplane. And that gets to the moral of the story. 2 in-flight emergencies, 2 maintenance issues declared by the pilots. Then you have a maintenance issue that requires it to be corrected somehow, inspected, verified, tested, validated, best judgment, what happened, right? Make the aircraft safe, again, either by repairing it or deferring it, right? And then put a logbook entry in. That's the way it works. Because it's the owner's operator's responsibility under B, 9145B, shall ensure that maintenance personnel make appropriate entries in the aircraft. So even if the spark plug was in place, the prudent thing to do is to go through and have the mechanic say, inspected aircraft, found to be in airworthy condition, no defect noted, fly away. Even if he doesn't admit that, well, maybe he thought in the back of his mind that, well, I didn't torque it, or I didn't use, this happens a lot, people, they'll go through and they won't re-anneal that little 5-cent washer. It's actually more than that now. I've just bought a bunch, like 20 cents a piece now. That little 20-cent washer, you either anneal it, make it soft again so it seals under torque, or put a new one in. I like to put new ones in. They're too cheap to me to anneal at what the hours that I get paid. Because if you don't, every time that piston comes up and puts pressure on that loose spark plug, untorqued spark plug, it just pushes out a little bit and it comes out. And again, very dangerous, because you could have fuel lines nearby. I mean, you're fuel injected, you've got the spark plug hole, and then on some have the spider fuel line right next to it. Very dangerous situations. So anyway, getting back to this story, you still required, the owner-operator, after an emergency landing, is still required to ensure the aircraft has been inspected and properly returned to service, even if there's nothing wrong. So the first example, the 2 pilots in that aircraft, one of them was the owners of the aircraft, did things exactly right. As soon as they landed, they called maintenance, because neither one of them were a mechanic, but they did their due diligence as the owner-operator of the aircraft. Versus the first one was worried about the FAA or somebody judging them, when in reality, you're just looking to make the aircraft safe and flying away. So that's the issue. So it's very interesting. I wanted to go back into 43.9. Like I said, this was kind of an impromptu video I wanted to put out tonight for everybody, because it hasn't been a while since I put one out, and I really would like to put more of these things out. Nobody's really watching right now, and that's fine. I mean, you'll see this later on in the video. But one other thing that I wanted to cover today is, it was an interesting story that came out. Again, we've been talking about the pilot shortage, and then that leads to the mechanic shortage. And it's talking about the ages of us, which I think is funny to me. Just simply because, let me go find, there we go. Let me pull that back up again. Open. It takes a window. How about over here? Well, someday I'm going to get this live feeding done. Anyway, it's an interesting situation, and they say it was a chart that was put out. I'm going to go through and pull it up, and I'll read it to you. Here we go. And it came out. It was a report, and I've seen them before. We've covered them before. We all know that we are going to be short mechanics in the future. I got it. Yes, that's true. But in the chart, it was really, really interesting when it talked about the average age. So it went through the comparison. It looked at people who work in the MROs, who work for the airlines. It excludes general aviation altogether. And what I'm finding out right now is general aviation, there are people that are working in it. I'm working in general aviation, but they're not working in the numbers because the MROs, the maintenance repair organizations, and the airlines are paying those wages to get people in. I think today I saw an advertisement, and I went through, and it was $1,900 a week, with an asterisk saying, plus we're going to be working you to death in overtime. But $1,900 a week is $47 an hour before taxes. So that's getting up there right now. And again, it gets back to your experience level. But the interesting part about the peak on that chart, and let me see if I can add chart here real quick and see if I can pull it up. It's so good. Let's do chart A. Sorry. Back to the video. Us old-time mechanics is right, no older than 70. We're not working past 70. It's a physical job. And I remember when I'm 60 this summer, and I was the last of the boom of the A&P mechanics that were produced, because I went to Spartan School of Aeronautics in Tulsa. I guess I was a legacy because my dad, my uncle, and my grandfather all went to Spartan. We had the end of the Vietnam era GI Bill, and a lot of mechanics came back from Vietnam, and that era became A&P mechanics during that time frame. And then 10 years later, when I got into the FA, that number dropped off rapidly as the GI Bill was beginning to go away. Now, the new GI Bill under the Gulf War veterans bills that came out, those people actually went more into high tech. Very few people went into aircraft maintenance. They went into more computer based, because that seemed to be what people wanted to do. So we do have a situation that is growing. And the source here is Oliver Wyman Analysis, and I'll put the link in the comment section below. And it's just talking about the fact that there's just not enough mechanics, aviation mechanics. And what are we going to do about it? And they're talking about one thing that they're trying to do about it, which I don't think is a good idea, is that we'll make it easier to get mechanics. Well, the problem is we're getting into the issue of quality mechanics, people with experience. You factor in COVID, and a lot of senior mechanics that would have graduated, or I'm sorry, that would have gradually retired, just all dropped. So you lost your source of OJT training for the new people coming in. That was one problem that's coming in. It has to do with the skills gap as far as people being able to do it. And there's still a problem of it's too hard. So that's something to look forward to. And what they're trying to say, the final bottom line is this. They're saying that we are going to need 21% more in the number than demand will supply. So this gets back to supply and demand, of course. So that is meaning that we need 45,000 mechanics between now and 10 years from now. And right now, we're only producing, I think the last number I looked at is about 2,000 A&P mechanics. Now, it's not including avionics technicians. And I have videos that talk about being an avionics technician. That still is a high skill set mechanic. I mean, it's still a person who needs to be highly skilled in that job. And I had a video that talked about you don't need a, you can go back and look in the last video, you only need a certificate to work in aviation. And I said, well, you don't, what I talked about in that video is you don't need to come to aviation with a certificate. Like, doctors have to go to doctor school and then you become a doctor in real life after you get your certificate. Well, A&P mechanics the same way. I go out and get my A&P and then I go to work. Well, an avionics technician can be hired as an avionics technician without that certificate, but you carry your skills with you. So the certificates you have are a lot. It's varied. Certificates I had was from the Air Force. I worked on avionics in the Air Force, or people in the Navy, people who are transitioning from electrical fields. If you do, even, quite frankly, sometimes I know people that work as electricians that transition well into avionics because they have the basics of electrical properties. They understand tools and equations and connections and how electricity flows in circuits. You just amp up the different, if I work on a house, I'm either going to have 220 voltage or 110 voltage. Well, an airplane, it has, maybe 110 voltage, but it also will have 24 volts, same as the battery. But it's not that much more difficult to learn. And that's what I try to teach people. It's not difficult to learn. So that is also affecting how we're working today in the field. So anyway, to close this up, I don't want to spend too much time on here with you. I don't want to waste your time. Sorry, I'm going to go back out. The rule 43.9 I wanted to show you, just simply stating that anybody who performs maintenance on an aircraft must document it. According to 91, the aircraft owner and operator is looking for that sign-off required by 43.9 for maintenance, anything that's done in maintenance, and inspections under 43.11. That was your annual inspection or progressive inspection. So I'm going to keep this short. Thank you for sticking with this long. Don't forget to hit the like button, please. Share this video. I'm up to close to, which I think I'm proud of. I'm actually getting pretty close to 3,000 subscribers now. I'm not 1 million subscribers. In fact, I was monetized for like a half hour. And now they dumped off the monetization, which, I understand because they're looking for influencers, and I'm just not an influencer right now. I have what's called a very niche career. In fact, I'm at 26.99 subscribers, And there's some channels I walk to and it says, we have 700,000 subscribers. Woo woo. Yeah, okay. Well, I ain't making $1 million here, people. I'm not making any money here. But I believe in aviation. I've enjoyed it for 42 years. I don't want to be the only one left in it. So don't ask me to close the door. Get involved. Take a look at my websites on the channel below. I talk about some books I'm putting out. The next video I'm putting out or the next trading course. One of my arguments, one of my complaints, if I have one, is the fact that I'm suffering from the terrible twos. As an IA, as a mechanic who holds an inspection authorization, I'm suffering from the terrible twos. I take too damn long, I'm too damn picky, and I'm too damn expensive. And the reason for that is that with me, you get a real annual. I actually inspect the aircraft versus the other less than stellar inspections that you get for $900. So you get what you pay for. But then by the time they come to me, because I have the reputation that you're going to get a real inspection, it's because you may not have had an annual last year or a biannual or a triannual, but you're bringing it to me because now you're afraid of your airplane. And then I'll spend, I don't know, it could be a month or two trying to order parts. Parts is still a nightmare right now. And then going back and researching the ADs for the last 40 years to make sure that you have the maintenance records to show that somebody signed for them. If you can't find a record, okay, that IA has to sign for. And the IA is an interesting certificate. And if you ever wondered about it, you only have to hold your A and P for 2 years. Not just your A, then your P, but your A and P for 3 years, and be actively engaged in aviation for 2 of the years prior to the application. Hold a certificate for 3 years, then be able to be actively engaged in aviation. And the FAR goes through and talks about what that is. However, that actively engaged in aviation doesn't say have ever performed a annual inspection or doing field approval or doing an annual inspection. And I'll get into annual inspections later on. Sorry if this thing cuts out. Again, it looks like I got a note that said it was cut out, so I'm sorry. We've had some really glitchy internet lately. So check out the new courses that are going on my Thinkific, so avionics-education.thinkific.com for my online courses, and also avionicseducation.com for the textbooks, and then live courses if you want to do it. So, hey, thanks for sticking it out with me tonight. I always enjoy doing the videos. I just wish I could get some more questions from you about subjects. Like I said, the 2 subjects I had came up this week for emergency landing. What do I do after emergency landing? So with that being said, have a good night. Keep it safe.